Welcome to another episode of Last Month's Games, a series where I play all the games I possibly can that come out in a calendar month and provide my feelings about them all at my wallet's expense. This month is absolutely stacked. I had a ton of fun with the games I played this month, so without further ado, let's get into it, shall we? The first OlliOlli game came out in 2014, exclusive to the Vita, and then ported to other platforms soon after. On the surface, it looked like a basic Flash game that you would sneakily play on HeavyGames.com in elementary school whenever your class got to go to the computer lab. But digging past its visuals, OlliOlli was a really fun game that promoted precise timing and dexterity to pull off tricks and making sure you don't crash and burn. The series got more exposure with its sequel that got a lot of positive attention. Fast forward to the current day with OlliOlli World, and it's quite inspiring to see how this small skateboarding series exponentially grew over a relatively short amount of time. 8 years, as a matter of fact. Gone are the pixelated visuals of the past, and in comes a sprawling, vibrant 3D art style that is simplistic with a lot of colorful flair. Laying my eyes on this game makes me so nostalgic for Rocket Power for some reason, even though the two have no connections with each other visually. OlliOlli World's transition into 3D, however, doesn't mean the gameplay gets the same treatment. It's not an open world skateboarding game akin to Skate or a Tony Hawk game. It is still very much rooted in a 2D skateboard platformer environment, but the twist on the formula is that the game now utilizes dynamic physics and different planes in its level design, so what may appear to be a pretty straightforward level will actually have numerous delineating paths and routes. These simple additions result in the most addicting, rewarding, and robust skateboarding game experience I have ever played. So when you first start out the game, you can customize your avatar and progressively get more cosmetics as you play. There is a narrative that is very cartoony and fits the overall vibe well, but no one's going to remember any of it really. The tutorial is pretty handholdy, but it doesn't take long for the training wheels to come off. The control scheme on controller was pretty unique. Most of the tricks, grinding, jumping, and speeding you're going to be doing are all motions with only the left stick. You can use other buttons for advanced tech, like perfectly timing your landings or adjusting your hang time, but 95% of what you're going to be doing is going to be completely dependent on your left thumb doing all the work. That may sound weird, but it's actually pretty easy to get the hang of. Everything from speeding up and slowing down to maneuvering alongside rails and walls are relegated to simple directional inputs, while the more advanced stuff like tricks and tech require a few buttons and some fighting game like special inputs. Actually playing OlliOlli World is very fluid and makes everything you do feel so cool and rewarding, but the best moments come from when the game puts your dexterity and quick thinking to the test with its insane levels later on. Beginning with some extremely simple tracks, OlliOlli World gradually shows its hand and sprinkles in advanced stuff little by little. The first area is very linear, but as you progress through the game, shit gets more and more wild to where levels now have numerous finishing points depending on which routes you take, and those routes have their own delineating routes, so the feeling of expansion over such a short amount of time is like sensory overload in a good way, but it doesn't leave you behind. It's actually really intuitive in how it educates a player of both the game's systems and mechanics alongside how to get the most out of them. Additional objectives are presented, and while they might seem mundane at first, like collect this amount of starfish or jump over this many houses, like the level design, they gradually get more and more challenging and obscure, where you have to find certain people who are hiding in certain planes of the levels, almost like they're Easter eggs, and that is something I absolutely love about this game. OlliOlli World constantly surprised me because it constantly took it up a notch. Just when I thought the levels couldn't get any crazier or more expansive than they already were, they just kept getting bigger and more intense by the minute. I had the feeling of holy shit, this can't get any crazier for almost 2 straight hours. I beat it in 3, and I was craving to go back and do levels over again in different ways to see everything as fast and as efficiently as possible. And you know what that speed and sensation OlliOlli World provides reminded me of? A legendary game series that was constantly running through my mind as I drew loving comparisons of it non-stop. Old school Sonic. I love 2D Sonic because underneath the adorable presentation is a gameplay experience that provided a lot of options in its compact and deliberate level design, meaning one run was never going to be enough, and it rewarded you for perfecting your speed and precision. These factors culminate into a game that's just super fun and never gets old no matter how much I play through them. I think those qualities about 2D Sonic absolutely apply to OlliOlli World on a fundamental level, and it makes it such an amazing game that I just want to play more of. And just for clarity's sake, yes, I have a bias for 2D 2D Sonic, but even without the comparison, I would still rave about everything OlliOlli World does incredibly well. I know this month was absolutely stacked, and every week there was a game that dominated video game discourse on the internet and in general, but how the fuck is no one talking about OlliOlli World? This game is absolutely phenomenal, and it just constantly blew me away with how geniusly it's designed and how insanely fun it is. I heavily implore you, please do not skip this. OlliOlli World is absolutely amazing. The first thing that stands out about Kingdom of the Dead is obviously its visuals. It's a black and white pen and ink art style with some good old red blood thrown in there too. The last game I recall looking like this was the Wii game Mad World, which was awesome in every possible way. I hope it gets a re-release. So seeing this art style return in a newer title was something that immediately caught my eye. The classic 40s, 50s horror setting produces some pretty cool levels of castles, dungeons, marshes, shipyards, and war-torn trenches. And the enemy designs are pretty creepy too, with some hyper exaggerated renditions of zombies, insects, cacodemons, and even wizards. It definitely has a Lovecraftian feel to it in terms of its influences. The lighting and shading, I think in particular, are pretty stellar. I love how dark the black is in this game.
I beg your pardon?
It's like staring into an abyss and really helps make the white stand out.
I beg your pardon?
In terms of its usage of buildings, greenery, and even the stars. The technical art isn't as strong as its art direction, however. There is a good bit of visual jank to be had with how enemies collide with each other and the environments. Most of the grunts you fight don't have very smooth animation, so you'll see some weird stuff, especially if they're using the stairs. It's not detrimental by any means, but it is noticeable. On top of that, the soundtrack consists of some very John Carpenter-esque dirgy synthwave that's surprisingly fitting. Kingdom of the Dead absolutely nails the aesthetic it goes for. It's the game's crowning achievement because honestly, the gameplay itself is nothing to write home about. As you can see, it's an arcadey first-person shooter that very much falls in the realm of a shoot-'em-up, and most of those are pretty fun. Just last month, I played Serious Sam Siberian Mayhem, and that game provided a good amount of thrills. Kingdom of the Dead, in comparison, is a much slower and more methodical game with how it structures its levels and places its enemies. You get 10 pretty straightforward levels with some cool set-piece moments, including this really cool one where a ship is tipped on its side, and you have to get to the top before you drown. The places you go to in these levels are really cool. Each one is like their own classic horror movie set. The issue that arose for me is that these different spaces have very little, if any, gameplay implications. They're nice to look at, they're really cool looking, but they're just backdrops to some pretty lacking level design. They're very linear with very little verticality and a ubiquitous method of getting weapons that I was puzzled by. You start off each level with one gun, and as you progress you find more guns to add to your arsenal, like a sniper, a shotgun, a missile launcher, so on and so forth. Problem is, you repeat that process every level. None of them carry over to the next level, so you end up finding the same guns over and over again. Some levels will add a weapon you can find, but when I have to recuperate the same arsenal I had no less than 5 minutes ago, I didn't feel much excitement when I saw a new weapon. Part of that also has to do with the fact that I think the gunplay is okay at best. The feedback and oomph isn't quite there, no matter how bloody or gory the action got. It didn't quite feel powerful. It doesn't help that the enemies in this game are really slow and really easy to kill. The enemy variety is there, but they are tuned to where they feel like moving targets as opposed to being vile creatures of the night that are trying to kill me. I felt the exact same way about the end bosses too. Every level has one, and visually they look cool, but they only have 1 or 2 attacks, which you can see coming from a mile away, plus they are very easy to kill as well. As long as you're moving, you'll be fine, and I feel that's detrimental in trying to make the player feel like a badass. In other games, the rush that comes from the power fantasy isn't because you inherently feel powerful, it's because you're overcoming and overpowering everything that stands in your way, no matter how big or menacing the threat is. I never once got that feeling in Kingdom of the Dead because of how non-threatening everything was, on top of its turtling pace. To my knowledge, in strenuous attempts, there was no difficulty slider. I thought these stars before each mission symbolized harder difficulties, but they just add extra objectives to the levels, and if you don't do them all, you fail the level, even if you kill the boss. okay? I was just on cruise control from level 3 onwards. My enjoyment of the game just plateaued 30 minutes in, and I was looking for a way to spice things up, like a weapon handicap or playing with one eye open or something along those lines. Eventually, I realized two things. One, there was no kill requirement to progress through a level, and two, whenever I sprinted, I never got hit. So one level, I just said, fuck it. And ran past everyone without taking damage, and I killed the boss. I finished the level in under a minute and 10 seconds. I did this 3 straight times, and I ended up beating the game in 2 hours. If I went back and tried this on every level, I probably can beat the game in 15 minutes or so and crown myself a speedrun master for Kingdom of the Dead. It's one thing to exploit bugs and stuff for speedruns, it's some of my favorite shit to watch in general, but here it feels like a massive oversight on the developer's end and further solidified how insanely easy this game is. When I finished it, I had no desire to replay it because I saw everything the game had to offer me pretty quickly. Kingdom of the Dead is not a bad game by any means and has a very positive rating on Steam, so don't take it from me. But for me, it's a game that could have used extra time to polish things up and better tune the overall experience. The visuals are great, and I'm glad to see how much love went into crafting its creatures and worlds, but when it comes to the gameplay, the simplistic approach and inherent dynamics left me wanting a lot more. Kingdom of the Dead is a decent time. I can't say I've ever played a game quite like Sifu. It's touted as a badass martial arts beat-em-up game, and it absolutely is. The power fantasy of mowing down waves of enemies through technique and discipline is unmatched. Maybe the closest things I could compare to it would be that old Jet Li PS2 game, which is a fucking gem by the way, or Yakuza. But what makes Sifu its own beast is how unapologetically challenging it is. It's made to reinforce the firm belief that mastery is achieved by repetition. And by repetition, I mean getting your ass handed to you over and over and over again until you learn how not to get your ass handed to you, and that is the beauty of Sifu. Speaking of beauty, in terms of its visuals and art direction, Sifu is the best looking game I have seen so far this year. Yes, I know Horizon Forbidden West and God of War Ragnarok might have something to say about that, but Sifu just excels on a whole other level with its presentation. It's very stylish and cinematic regardless of it being in a cutscene or in-game. It pays a ton of homage to famous martial art films. The Pixar-esque art style is dope, the textures and geometry look stellar, the artistry on display is just pure eye candy, everything from the color usage to the unique thematic palettes to the gorgeous architecture and atmospheres to the character designs are all super good looking. 4 out of the 5 levels have their own elemental theme: fire, water, wind, and earth. The way these elements manifest themselves in their respective levels is jaw-dropping. For example, let's take the nightclub level, which is beautiful to look at initially. The lighting, the neon, the graded blues and reds are superbly done. Every space of this area is visually refined to emanate a realistic rave setting. As you progress through the level, you get these surreal transitions that transform the terrain before your very eyes. What was once an alleyway is now a burning trail of destruction. What was once a dance floor is now an incendiary pit, and what was once a dojo is now a scorched battlefield. My favorite level by far is the museum, which is just insane. I've played through this level like 50 times and I'm still amazed at what I'm looking at. I can't stress enough how much visual splendor I got with every second I spent playing this game. I hope the art team especially gets their kudos for the seamless beauty they were able to craft. The settings and layouts alongside how the camera works in this game gave me the ability to make my own hype kung fu movie moments at any time I wanted, and that feeling never faded no matter how many times I played through the game. That does bring up the one sore spot for the game, which is the camera. At a few points, it's not your best friend, it can clip through walls and sometimes completely obscures your vision, but it didn't happen enough for me for it to be a glaring issue. So that aside, if this game does not win a lot of art related awards, something is wrong. When it comes to playing Sifu, it's kind of structured like a roguelike, but not really. I refer to it as that purely because it is designed as if you were completing runs. The levels aren't very long, you can beat them in less than 10 minutes and beat the whole game in less than 2 hours. Nothing is procedurally generated, everything is constant with the only variable being you. Your age goes up the more you die, your upgrades do not carry over after deaths, and you only get a a limited amount of deaths before you fail and have to start all over. You don't just respawn with everything intact as if it were a checkpoint. There is always something to lose, and those losses can avalanche into devastating proportions that can absolutely ruin a run. Again, it reinforces mastery through repetition because death is so costly, and I can see how that was a point of contention for people who want to play games to have fun, not work for it. But Sifu gives you an ample amount of tools through a very basic and accessible control scheme. The button layout is very simple and easy to get a grasp of. Doing attacks, grabbing items, parrying, special attacks, and dodging are pretty easy to do, but there are a pretty sizable amount of options to be had, so you can play the game for the most part however you like. You can bloody your fists and splint your shins all you want, or you could use makeshift weapons like bottles, seats, bow staffs, bats, and ink-filled light bulbs to your advantage as well. The upgrade system is interesting because there are a lot of moves and status upgrades, but you're not going to get every one of them in one run because the XP gain and economy isn't scaled to where that is possible unless you are a fucking god. Picking and choosing which abilities and status upgrades would best suit a playstyle or handle enemies in a more efficient manner is essential, incentivizing trying out new moves when your current deck of techniques isn't quite getting it done. With those components in mind, everything you can possibly acquire and learn is necessary to succeed. When it comes to the combat, I can't help but swoon over it. Sifu has one of the most fluid and smoothest combat systems I have ever played. Part of that has to do with just how stellar the animation work is. Every frame is so seamless, the way people interact around others and the environments is effortless. There was never a feeling of wonkiness or jarring jank to me whenever I fought. Every action I did felt incredibly responsive, so whenever I died, I never once blamed the game itself. It plays super well, which helped when taking on a buttload of enemies or the intimidating bosses who are all but one super sick to fight. Once you learn how certain enemy types fight and how to approach them 1v1 or in a group, the feared learning curve wasn't as steep as I thought. Yeah, the first time fighting a new enemy was scary, but that's just a natural occurrence in video games. I quickly learned their tells and patterns and just started to mop the floor with them. My feeling of progression and growth wasn't from the fact that I knew how to beat enemies, it was how I was beating them. Getting into a rhythm, knowing how many were going to be in a room at one time, using my skills and makeshift weapons in tandem to maximize my time and effort was the real metric of seeing how far I'd come. Each run I did filled me with more and more confidence to the point where I want to come back to Sifu to do runs where I beat the game as fast as possible, or a run where I don't get hit. I mean, seeing the runs that other people were doing was just straight up inspiring. The replayability of this game is just off the charts. It's hard to resist the urge of just doing one more run. A lot of people were expecting Sifu to be a straightforward game with a simple philosophy of beat people up and you win. But to a lot of people's surprise, it completely defied that expectation and focused more on the intrinsic value of the experience. A good portion of the mass had their qualms about how much work and practice you had to put into it, but I loved the challenge and work it demanded of me because to me, Sifu is like a single player fighting game. The rewarding feeling of seeing your training pay off results in some of the most badass feeling combat I've ever played in a game. I really hope there is more in store for this franchise in the future, whether it be a new DLC or a new game entirely. The foundation here is just too rich to let it sit unused. And before I end this segment, I just wanted to throw in that Sifu has one of the most hype opening video game levels ever. But yeah, I loved Sifu. Sifu is phenomenal. Most of you may have heard about Martha is Dead after it was known that Sony censored some parts of it for some reason. Apparently there was just some very highly sensitive content, so sensitive in fact that Sony just deemed that the public couldn't see it. Very interesting for a platform that has games on it like Last of Us 2 and Resident Evil 2 and Mortal Kombat 11. Anyways, I actually had this game on my radar prior to this because it looked very interesting and I love me some spooky games. Martha is Dead is set in 1944 Italy in the middle of World War II, and its premise is that one day by the lake, identical sisters Julia and Martha are taking photos when all of a sudden, Martha is nowhere to be found. Julia looks for her and finds that Martha has drowned and washes up nearby. She is in total shock and does not say a word. The sister's parents quickly come to check out the commotion and tragically see the corpse of their daughter. They quickly comfort Julia, but because Martha was deaf and mute and Julia wasn't saying a word, the parents think Julia is the one who drowned and that Martha survived. From this point forward, Julia masquerades as Martha as she tries to figure out what happened to her sister and if her demise was a result of the supernatural spirits of death that roam around the region through methods of developing photos and revealing war conspiracies for the resistance since her dad is a Nazi officer. From that description alone, it's enough to hook even those who had no interest in the game. And when I was playing through the first 2 hours, I was in a constant mode of intrigue to see how these elements of the supernatural and war tied into the overarching narrative of finding out what happened to Martha. The storytelling initially kicks off with a bang and introduces a lot of family dynamics that reveals a lot of family tension. Julia's mother, for example, loves Martha to death but greatly hates Julia. And when I mean hate, I mean this bitch is vilely venomous towards her. She is Skip Bayless levels of hater.
I just busted right inside him.
So Julia has to completely ignore all of the snarky hate from her mother as well as the tearful ruminations of her father. And in addition to both parents somehow not being able to tell their daughters apart, like seriously, no moles or scars or freckles or anything? Yeah, okay, whatever you say. Other figures actually have their own beliefs as to who died. The identity switcheroo has Julia learning more and more about Martha as she walks further down in her shoes and works itself into the loose threads of the specter of death in the woods and the impending war that's quite literally knocking on the front door. There are more than a few psychological horror set pieces that are pretty unnerving and creepy to partake in, like cutting off your dead sister's face, for example, and makes both Julia and the player question whether any of this is truly real or if it's all in Julia's head, which is actually what lies at the center of the story. It's a deep dive into Julia's psyche because she has a lot of ongoing mental health issues, and she proves to be quite an unreliable narrator. Certain dialogue and events are completely misconstrued and misrepresented, but since it's all from Julia's perspective, it's up to the player to fit the pieces of the puzzle together and decipher what's real and what isn't, as if you were Julia herself. So, there is a lot going on in the story. It's quite juicy, in fact, but how does that translate in a gameplay sense? Martha is Dead is a very on-rails experience that throws in some open hub puzzles and mysteries to have you explore. You are confined to the tightly knit estate, forest, and lake, so you won't be seeing any new vistas of any kind. Certain areas are completely inaccessible at certain points in the game, so you really have to play by its rules. Each parting day gives you a task for the day for Julia to get closer and closer to the truth, and often present themselves as Resident Evil type puzzles where you have to find certain keys and objects to progress to the next day in order to access new areas and find new things. Most of these are pretty lame and feel like they're there just to lengthen the game's runtime, like this annoying Morse code one, for example. The core mechanic of the game is the photography. You take pictures of the real and unreal, develop them in your basement, and use these pictures to help uncover certain mysteries. There's actually quite a lot of depth to the camera options. You have to adjust the lens and lighting and exposure to capture certain shots, and you also get additional tools to use with the camera later on, but there's barely anything to capture outside of the story segments, no meaningful secrets of any kind to my knowledge, so all of the additional options just feel super excessive in the end. I feel like there was a greatly missed opportunity to incentivize and reward players for putting the extra time in to explore and take pictures of stuff. There's also these sections where you automatically run in the pitch black woods and choose the correct individual words to piece together into a sentence, almost like an epiphanous prophecy. You don't control anything besides whether you go left or right, and there is no fail state at all in this game, so anything you do is pretty inconsequential. In terms of mechanics and stuff, it's very bare bones and linear and can definitely be classified as a walking simulator of sorts, so the narrative must carry the bulk of the load for the player to remain invested. Did this game do that for me? No. Martha is Dead quickly falls apart because not only does the actual gameplay underwhelm for 99% of the game, the story just goes all over the place. It doesn't come close to finding the right balance for all of the narrative threads it's trying to pack into a 4 or 5 hour experience, so certain plot lines go nowhere and completely vanish later on without a trace, and established story events completely lose their impact and believability. Things just kind of happen for shock value, and a good portion of the major plot points happen off screen and are just explained in these loading screens. These are cataclysmic events happening that completely turn the story on its head, and not only are they relegated to narrated text, the game will just carry on as if these figurative nuclear bombs did not just drop on top of everybody. The game's attempts at trying to have me question what was real and what wasn't just got tiring because the writing gradually devolved over time. There was just too much ground to cover and not enough time to do so. The beginning is extremely slow and methodical, but past the 2.5-hour mark, it rushes so many plot threads and it feels so incomplete. The game at the end then asks you what you actually think happened, and all of the endings are completely the same regardless of what options you choose. There is no sense of replayability because everything in the game is scripted to produce one singular outcome, so giving you choices at the end really does nothing when I can't change shit anyway. Like, there are good moments here and there. A few sections of the game were actually quite terrifying and played with the unreliable narrator standpoint incredibly well, and the resounding sentiment of mental health did provide some interesting insight, but it feels like the writers just got a bit too ambitious and couldn't quite rein it all in to be a cohesive experience, almost as if they chose the wrong story to tell. As a result, the entire experience I had with this game just soured for me completely, and when it wasn't the gameplay or the story letting me down, it was the performance issues. This game ran like complete ass when I stepped outside at times. The frame rate dipped into single digits, and in order to fix it, I had to disable and re-enable DLSS like 50 fucking times. This happened a lot and mostly all in the same area. I didn't have any crashes though, so there's that. Overall, I appreciate the ambition and love put into this game because those factors are pretty evident throughout, and the story does have its moments of horror brilliance that will stick with me for a while, but in the end, the narrative doesn't pay off in ways that I find interesting or fulfilling or logical, and it's not fun to actually play. Martha is Dead is not my cup of tea. The King of Fighters series hasn't been huge in the West during its tenure, which I attribute to a lot of the Western audience being huge Capcom fighting game simps, including me, who couldn't be bothered to play anything else but Street Fighter or Marvel vs. Capcom and absolutely defiled other fighting game series as being woefully inferior. How the fuck were you gonna tell me that this truck driver and this emo Hot Topic bitch were cooler than Spider-Man, Chun-Li, and Wolverine fighting Deadpool, Doctor Strange, and Dante? You couldn't. But since then, things have changed, so other fighting games got their time to shine, and more series are finally getting the attention they deserve. With Terry getting in Smash and 15 getting rollback netcode, the series got a huge influx of people getting into it, and it will most likely end up being the most popular and best-selling KOF ever. The strongest aspect about 15 is that even though it has completely different mechanics than all of its predecessors sans KOF14, it's still at its core King of Fighters. Now you might be saying, well yeah dumbass, it's in the title isn't it? Shouldn't it be a King of Fighters game if it's called King of Fighters 15, you fucking idiot?
You piece of shit! You fucking goddamn fucker! Listen, fuckhead! You have fucking crossed the line!
Let me explain. Recent fighting games such as Street Fighter V, MK11, and Guilty Gear Strive underwent huge gameplay transformations that were tailored towards simplifying their mechanics and even removing signature ones so that lower skilled players could easily learn and play the game without feeling overwhelmed. I don't agree with that philosophy, but this is not inherently a bad thing. I love Guilty Gear Strive, for example, but for me, I prefer fighting games that expand upon their core systems to offer up more possibilities rather than tone everything down. KOF15 does not venture onto a similar route because it builds off of the foundation of KOF14 and expands upon it in every way, while keeping the core elements that made KOF such a staple franchise in the first place still intact. You still got a lot of movement options like rolling, running, and hopping. Its iconic 3v3 gameplay is still here. It's still a very fast-paced, high-damaging game, and it's still a challenging game. KOF15 is the easiest game in the series to learn and play, but that does not correlate to it being easy in its nature. You have to be extremely precise and timely with your inputs, you have to know how to and when to get out of tricky situations, and you have to learn at least 3 characters and be decently familiar with them to have a fighting chance. Which may sound daunting to a lot of newcomers because although everyone is technically a newcomer to 15 because it's a new game, it tremendously respects legacy skill, meaning people who have been playing King of Fighters for nearly the last 30 years know it inside and out, and they will absolutely kick your ass. You are not going to be seeing Lupe Fiasco beating Xiaohai anytime soon. I mentioned earlier that 15 was the easiest in the series to learn, and the game does have some modes to teach you core mechanics as well as how characters are and what their kits and tools provide. The tutorial goes over basics and essentials, but it doesn't really go far enough in terms of teaching players how to actually play the game in real time. Instead, you get stuff like this, which is bound to confuse the living hell out of people. It has a really good training mode though, although I'm not sure why frame data is not quantitative. These pluses and minuses don't really help much, but okay. Most of you have heard about the infamously difficult KOF13 trials, but you don't have to worry about 15s because they're extremely easy, so you can get a pretty good grasp at what each character can do in a pretty short amount of time. But it is very surface level in terms of exploring everything they can do. A lot of characters have some pretty advanced stuff that you will have to fish out by looking them up. Ash, for example, has a level 2 install where his charge moves are now simple inputs and he can cancel special moves into command normals, which leads to some pretty fucking absurd shit. But this is never explained as to how it works or even brought up in his trials, so it's not very intuitive for someone who's trying to learn a character right off the bat. When you have tutorials like Killer Instincts and Guilty Gears that go the extra mile to teach you everything about the game, this in comparison is just not good enough. Another thing that is not good enough is the bare bones single player content at launch. Just for clarity, I am talking specifically about the fact that there's only pretty much an outdated arcade story mode and admittedly cool draft versus mode, and that's it, which is pretty pitiful for a $60 game. You only get these static animated cutscenes at the end of each team's completion, and that's it. No extra colors, no extra costumes. I don't mind personally because I don't play fighting games for their single player modes, but for those who want to do something besides fight people online, they're going to be thoroughly underwhelmed. When you compare it to the offerings of NRS games and Smash, what's offered here at day one is a pure joke. As a base package though, you're getting quite a lot of overall content. Visually, the game looks a million times better than 14. It has a pretty nice, vibrant art style, and a lot of the redesigns are actually pretty fire. It's not the best looking game though. There are some pretty weird and rough spots here and there, but I think overall it looks good. The game launches with 39 unique fighters, which is a huge roster for any game not named Smash Ultimate at launch, although 31 of the 39 were in KOF 14 and have been basically copy pasted into 15. When you see that 14 launched with 50 characters, finished with 58, and 15 is reusing nearly every asset they had, it's hard to beat the feeling that there could have been more characters, alongside the fact that there are some pretty big omissions from the cast, like Kim fucking Kafwan. I know he's gonna be DLC, but still. You also got some good looking stages, but I don't really like how empty these stages are. Past KOF games had really populated stages to make the games really feel like an authentic world tournament, where different cultures and ways of life embrace KOF in their own ways, and that was amazing. If you look at the stages from 2002, 98, and KOF 13, the energy from those stages still holds up to this day. 15 stages don't come anywhere close to what the series had to offer. There's also a jukebox with over 300 songs, which is pretty cool, although I don't really like the unlock requirements. You have to complete arcade mode over a dozen times with different teams, and the unlock prompt only has 2 of the 3 characters listed, while the third one is mysterious. Listen, with 39 characters, I don't have time to sift through 37 other potential ones just to get a soundtrack. Naturally, I just looked the requirements up, but it still took a chunk of time to unlock all of them, and it just got really boring. I guess this was their method of providing some form of single player content since they barely have any to begin with, but I hope this way of unlocking anything is never done ever again. So, not much to do by yourself. Well, there's always something to do by yourself. SNK invested a lot into the online portion of the game, and it's easily the series' most robust offering in that regard. First off, it has rollback netcode, which has become a pretty big fighting game buzzword, but for good reason. The netcode is really good. There are some small lapses where the audio doesn't sync up correctly, but the overall experience of actually playing online is great. The problem really lies with the game's matchmaking, which is not great right now. Oftentimes I would sit and wait for games for upwards of like 20 minutes, or the game would constantly match me with people who were AFK and would not accept the battle prompts. It happens a good bit of the time, and it's always pretty frustrating. So, I have talked enough about the extracurriculars. Now I want to talk about the gameplay. 15's gameplay is just grafted over from 14, so much so that the feel and look of the game are facsimiles, so I can see why some people call this game KOF 14 2.0. But there are so many enhancements across the board to where the game is just non-stop fun. The biggest changes come from how the meter works in this game. You still have your level 1, level 2, and level 3 supers and your EX moves, but how they economically function is vastly different than any other game in the series. EX moves only cost half a bar, so you have access to more tools more often. Max mode has been completely reworked to where it is now deadlier than ever. It still functions the same with 2 different versions that are now color-coded, with quick max mode being being pink and normal max mode being blue, and both of them cost 2 bars to activate. But when they're activated, you can use level 1 supers at no cost. You can do level 2s and level 3s at the cost of 1 extra bar. So take this combo for example. It takes a total of 4 bars if I do it normally.
That's a lot of damage.
If I use max mode, it costs 3 bars.
That's a lot of damage.
So I save a bar, which is pretty essential because meter is everything in this game. Figuring out what works best for each character and what scenarios to use them in is such a satisfying feeling. Meter management in this game is geniusly designed, and what I love the most about it is that the more meter you use, the more reward you get. Every character has the means to deal massive damage if they have meter, regardless of their placing on the tier list. Add this to the other components of the game's pace, how many unique characters there are, and how many options the game gives you for various situations. You just have a fantastic fighting game that offers so much when you actually play it. And this is just the vanilla version. With future updates and balance changes, it could get even better. This is definitely the most in-depth I've ever talked about a game, and that's because I want more people to play KOF15 as well as just fighting games in general. 15 is the most fun I've had with a fighting game in the last 5 or so years. This entry is arguably one of the best in the series. It has its rough edges. The PC port has a few issues with its online and overall stability, the matchmaking needs to get fixed, and crossplay needs to happen down the road. But I'm confident that over time all of these issues will get ironed out and it will be a landmark fighting game for the future. The King of Fighters 15 is stellar. I love the first Dying Light. To me, it's the second best zombie game ever made. Here's my top 3 for reference in case you were curious as to what number 1 was. It was such a refreshing take on a zombie game in a very oversaturated market where a lot of games were lazily just cashing in on the trend. Mixing Mirror's Edge's parkour and Dead Island's combat ended up being quite a genius idea, which is why despite the game not having great critic scores, it became a cult classic. So with Dying Light 2, there's a lot to live up to, not only because of the expectations that naturally come with making a sequel, but also because of the standards Dying Light 2 set for itself, with its marketing emphasizing a robust pick-your-own-adventure narrative where every choice has drastic effects, alongside boasting that it will take 500 hours to see and do everything in the game. I think Dying Light 2 is a great game overall and makes a lot of neat improvements, but it definitely underwhelms in a few areas as well that made me miss certain things from the original. The new setting and visual direction for 2 is a huge change from the original. Villador is much more vibrant and colorful with a unique outlook on how humanity adapted to the zombie apocalypse, where civilization primarily functions from the rooftops with huts, gardens, and even trees. It's a pretty big departure from the small-scale rundown city of Haran and its brown burnt color filter alongside the ash and smog infesting the open air. Haran had its share of verticality, but most of the exploration had you decently close to the ground. Dying Light 2 encourages staying off the ground and knowing your way up and down, in and out. The sheer amount of interior density is vast. You can go into virtually any building you see in some way, and even though some of these interiors are noticeably copy-pasted, there's always something worthwhile in the form of items or loot. And that's just in the starting area. Eventually, when you get to the city of endless high-rises, it's mouth-watering to see. There's always a few or more ways to get where you need to go, and that is something to be applauded. The general world design and layout creates so many unique districts and areas with so many ways to get around. I also think Dying Light 2's gameplay is an overall improvement. The parkour in 2 is the most fun parkouring I have ever done in a game. It completely one-ups the original in every way. I'm still surprised, by the way, that there aren't any more first-person parkour games. I feel like it's still an untapped market, but I digress. The way the world is designed plays a big factor into it because there's a lot of assisting elements working in tandem with the sheer scale and accessibility. You got zip lines, makeshift elevators, bridging rooftops, swings, and more. You just have more things at your disposal too, with more parkour skills in your arsenal, like propelling yourself off of objects and running alongside walls, to even getting a glider for when you launch yourself off of a building. You're given a lot of options and a lot of space to maneuver however you like, chaining together other skills, and maintaining my locomotion and momentum led to a lot of thrills and excitement just by running around and seeing something I wanted to climb and just doing it. Figuring out how to get on top of certain buildings that at first seemed impossible were actually in the realm of possibility once I got more creative and daring with my approach. The verticality and elevation just goes such a long way toward making exploration feel rich and exciting even when you're visiting the same places over and over again. It's just a perfect playground that never gets old. Combat has also been expanded and it feels more arcadey and exaggerated in a good way. It doesn't feel as grounded as the original's combat, which had a meaty, crunchy feeling, which put me off at first because the weightiness and impact of my hits just felt a bit too light. But I got used to it over time and just had a ton of fun going full-on Mortal Kombat on everything I saw. It's really over the top, bloody, and gory. Aiden is more mobile than Crane ever was in combat. He has more offensive and defensive tools like parrying and vaulting over somebody in combat. Similar to parkour, you can combo together skills for some really satisfying kills. Human enemies aren't that dumb anymore and are actually quite challenging when you fight 10 or more of them at a time, and some of the new zombie types provided some nice changes of pace in how I approached them. I don't remember ever using anything else besides melee weapons in my playthrough. I don't even think guns are in this game, and the couple of projectile weapons that do exist, I never felt encouraged to use them. I just preferred going the tactile route and just fighting everyone mano a mano. Another enhancement in my opinion is one of the extra layers added to playing at night. There are two new mechanics at play. One is an infection meter where the longer you stay in the dark, the more at risk you are to turn, and the only way to hold off the infection is through UAV consumables or getting your butt to a safe place with the UAV lights pre-installed. I actually really loved this mechanic. It gave stealth sections and overall movement at night an intense feeling of urgency. Those moments where I was deep inside of an overrun building trying to get some supplies before I turned were tense. On one hand, I was trying not to alert the sleeping zombies, but on the other, I was running out of time and I had to move quickly. This dynamic was always an effective motivator to plan out everything, where the nearest safe place was, where to escape in case I get cornered, and learning when to concede defeat and try again. The other mechanic added was the chase level, which functions like the GTA star system, and I will firmly say I do not like this mechanic. I'd rather be chased in a more organic fashion as opposed to unleashing certain zombies just based on my corresponding chase level, including volatiles. These menacing creatures who used to lurk around every corner in the original are now just relegated to being pure chase gimmicks, which also adds to the feeling of night not being as threatening as it could have been. I'm not really sure what compelled them to go in this direction, but it really doesn't have any benefits in my opinion. When it comes to Dying Light 2's premier attraction in the form of a branching choice-based narrative, I think it's a double-edged sword. I think it works extremely well for the side missions because you can see the immediate result of your choices as everything happens in real time. In the main story, the results of your choices feel like a ripple. They aren't inherently clear because the game tries to present them in a subliminal butterfly effect manner. But in my experience, I didn't feel as if much had changed. Granted, I only played through the game once and it took me 30 hours to initially beat with a lot of stuff left over, so when I replay it later this year with my friends, I will definitely put the branching choices to the test because there are a bunch of make or break decisions that the game throws at you, but it seemed like I would arrive at the same destination regardless of what I picked. As for the actual narrative itself, it's doo-doo. It doesn't bother me or detract from the overall experience in any way, but I know it will matter to quite a few people. I didn't expect much of a good story because zombie games in general don't have good stories, only like 2 of them do in my opinion, plus the first game story was not very good either, but at least it had one of the most unintentionally hilarious villains in video game history with Rise. This Voss wannabe just cracked me up with how many times he wanted me to be a man.
That is what makes a man. Will you be a dog and save the dwellers of the tower? Or will you be a man? Prove you are a man! Just take your vengeance!
Will you just shut the fuck up?
Crane, as a result of recent layoffs at your company, you now no longer have an occupation. You have defaulted on your last 3 home loan payments, and now the bank is threatening to repossess your property. Are you going to foreclose your house, Crane? Or are you going to be a man? But in spite of narrative incompetency, Dying Light's missions supplement that by just being insanely fun and memorable. There were a lot of exhilarating set pieces, and 2 is no different. I still get chills thinking about how awesome the tower mission is, or how thrilling it was running through the infested subway tunnels. Every mission offered something new, and I really liked how much variety there was in that regard. Like I said, Dying Light 2 improves on everything from the first game, and it's a great sequel. I know some people aren't as high on it right now, and I get it. Dying Light 1 was a trailblazing title, so of course anything that comes after it will not meet everyone's expectation, but it wasn't like the first one was an instant hit or anything. It took quite some time before people really started to clamor about it, and I think 2 will go through something similar, especially considering it's going to get expansions and a lot of content coming down the road, which I'm pretty excited for. I highly recommend Dying Light 2 because you're getting a lot in the base package, and given Techland's history of supporting their titles over a long time, it will be a worthwhile investment. It doesn't hit every mark it strides for, but it hits most of them dead on, and even if the story doesn't fulfill its promises, when you have a game that is this fun to actually play, who the fuck cares? Dying Light 2 is awesome. I thought the first Horizon game was really good. I loved the setting of the game, the concept of civilization devolving back to their tribalistic roots, while technology advanced so far ahead that it skynetted the planet and mimicked nature the best it could, was a genius way to ground the simple idea of fighting robot animals with bows and arrows. The gameplay was super addicting. Every encounter I had with the machine in the wild was like its own boss fight with how vicious and unforgiving some of them could be. It was like a blockbuster version of Monster Hunter. Zero Dawn was just a very fun game to play, but I had my fair share of issues with it. For as good as it looked, there was a lot of visual jank. Fighting humans in the game was so boring, melee combat was non-essential, Aloy could not scale or use anything in the environment unless the game wanted you to, which was infuriating. The world's characters were so stiff and unremarkable, even the legend Lance Reddick himself couldn't catch my attention.
So when did I come into this? Our path together?
All y'all! All y'all! Warp speed, don't rainbow read me, nigga!
And the narrative itself was just an incredibly generic by-the-numbers hero story. Despite the rich foundation in its concept, they just told the most risk-free story they could. Fast forward to Forbidden West, and it's essentially the same game with its core components and everything, but it's better in every way possible. Usually with the sequel, people end up missing a certain something about the original that made it so special in the first place. Take what I said about Dying Light 2 earlier, for example. I love Dying Light 2, but there are a couple of things about Dying Light 1 that I sorely missed in 2 and felt didn't need to be omitted or changed in any way. There was no such sensation like that at any point during Forbidden West for me. I never once went, you know, that was better in Zero Dawn. Forbidden West is a superior game than Zero Dawn in every aspect imaginable. Visually, oh my goodness, this game is constantly breathtaking. There was so much work put into the visual presentation of this game, and it fucking pays off. Every character in this game has life and personality to them, even the ones you only see once or twice. Their texture work is great, all of them are very expressive, so seeing new people actually carried a sense of intrigue. The machines still look amazing and their animations are still awesome. The lighting and use of color is just gorgeous and even more vibrant than ever. Like, look at the water, bro, I just want to eat it. The scale of the world leads to so many moments where I just stopped and took in the broad horizons and jubilant vistas in the distance. Each biome is just eye candy no matter what part of day it is, and there's also a dynamic weather system to complement them, so it'll rain, snow, or even sandstorm at times, and it keeps the world feeling alive. And I really want to highlight the detail and environmental storytelling that's here. There's a ton of rusted machinery and facilities, flooded factories, torn down buildings that nature vegetated over time, and vestiges of classic American landmarks that still stand out as eye-catching structures despite being in a ruinous state. What stood out to me the most was the underwater buildings and highways. Upon looking at these, I was just amazed that they cared enough to actually put these there. I grew such a profound appreciation at the amount of work put into this world, especially after I unlocked the ability to fly. I have no idea where you even go from here visually for the next game, but considering how talented their art team is, they'll find a way. In terms of gameplay, it virtually plays the same as Zero Dawn, but with a lot of refinements and minor additions. Buying weapons, gathering resources, and crafting are all basically the same. The most notable improvement is the melee combat, which actually has a purpose in this game, and it's pretty fun. Aloy does actual damage and has actual combos now.
This dude did a 10-hit combo! This dude's doing strength!
The upgrade trees are massive, and there are these power-ups with anime-like cutscenes that have a lot of cool effects. Fighting machines is as exhilarating as ever, and human enemies no longer feel dull to fight. They still don't hold a candle to the robots, but at least they're more formidable foes than last time. Also gotta mention that there is a lot more scalability in the world, so Aloy can climb most rock formations she comes across, which adds another layer to the exploration. There were some restrictions that pissed me off, but it is nowhere near as limiting as Zero Dawn was. The world in general, from a quest standpoint, has a lot to offer too. The side content is pretty engaging, you know, the presentation and dedicated mocap helps, but there are some genuinely interesting stories and personal tales that contribute to the overall world building that go far beyond being simple fetch quests.
Let's go check on those miners.
The tall necks, for example, are your basic radio towers to unveil parts of the map, but each one is extremely unique in terms of how you get on the thing. I was amazed at the creativity that went into these small missions because they could have been a lot more mundane. I've seen a lot of comparison between Forbidden West side quest and Witcher 3's side quest, and I think in terms of having a huge map that puts the spotlight on its smaller entities relative to the main story, it's a fair comparison. Although I think in terms of writing Forbidden West's best quests, that's a fucking bar by the way, don't come near Witcher 3's worst. While I am riding the critique wave, Forbidden West does have its issues. I played it late after I got a patch or two, and I still had my share of glitches and stuff, especially with pop-in. There is a lot of visual jank to behold during combat where the models don't quite sync up right during certain attack animations. There were also spots where Aloy would get caught on the smallest object in the area and would not move despite having an automatic parkour mechanic, and definitely caused frustration when fighting the tougher enemies. Aloy's hair physics are almost like Necalli's from Street Fighter 5, they go haywire sometimes. They bounce and slither around like she's fucking Medusa. Not a deterrent by any means, but it is definitely distracting. I also didn't really like how despite having more tools in your arsenal for puzzles and exploring, the game still essentially plays itself for a lot of its smaller set piece moments, where you follow a very specific plotted out sequence of events to progress rather than figuring stuff out for yourself. Most evidently being when you have to platform in these smaller areas and only being able to use certain tools for their hyper specific purpose. With this being a sequel, I would have hoped to have more expansive options in terms of problem solving rather than the game constantly hand-holding me just to make sure I don't fail or mess up even the simplest of tasks. And I gotta mention the story because once again, it is the weakest link in the whole game. Again, a very rich concept on paper, and in practice, they tell the most safe and innocuous story they possibly can. I don't know how you have both Lance Reddick and Carrie Ann Moss in the same game together, and they feel absolutely wasted. The story starts off strong with a few interesting twists and plot lines, but as it went on, it just got progressively worse and worse with quite a few head-scratching moments, and that ending is so stupid. For the record, I did like Aloy a lot more in this game than I did in Zero Dawn because she is given room to actually grow as a character, but it drove me crazy how nothing in this world gets done without her help. They try to emphasize her trusting people and building relationships and even go as far as giving her her own Scooby Gang, but everyone is essentially her bitch and she is the ultimate savior. She is always right, she knows everything, she's smarter than everyone. When she messes up, it actually ends up going right. A master strategist, an impeccable diplomat, an unbeatable warrior. Like, she can do no wrong, she can never lose, and that just led to a story where everyone around Aloy just lay around with their fingers up their asses and wait for her to do something. So when the game tries to make me care about these side characters, they don't pull their weight enough or do anything for me to even remember their names.
He realized I was having trouble sleeping. I was nervous about the mission. To be honest, I think we both were. So
do I look like I care
he asked me to join
about
him
any of them niggas? I don't!
He brought up this hologram.
Again, considering that this is a sequel that still isn't going the distance with its storytelling, I felt more disappointed with Forbidden West's story even though it's more memorable than Zero Dawn's. But again, when you have a game that's this fun to actually play, who cares about story in the end, right? I had a lot of fun with Forbidden West. I think this game is everything a sequel should be. It improves on everything from the original, it does a lot of things right, and it was really addicting for a large part of my 40-hour playthrough. I still have a lot of quests and side content to do, and I'm excited to jump back into it whenever I get the time. With an obvious third game down the line, I am eagerly awaiting to see what it will have to offer and how it will build off of this absolutely stellar entry. Horizon Forbidden West is superb. What can I really say about Elden Ring that hasn't already been said? It's already set in stone as most outlets and players' game of the year. Just give it the award already, Jeff. I know you want to. Rather than explain in detail what Elden Ring is, since I'm sure most people know by now, I just want to list out what I love about this game. I love the world, the sheer scope of it, the insane amount of locales and areas. It was a mind-blowing experience whenever I accidentally ventured into somewhere new. Everywhere I went, there was always something new and surprising around the corner, which felt great to find considering that the layout of the lands between is meticulously constructed to actively hide things from you. This is a fractured and inorganically compounded world where things are not where they should be. The topography is so uneven, the verticality is skewed by every metric, but that invites an initiative to problem solve, with the most frequent questions being, where the fuck am I going and how the fuck am I getting there? With every second playing this game, my eyes were feasting upon the beautiful landmarks, horizons, and natural scapes, but they were also hyper-focused to notice even the smallest bit of environmental weirdness going on so I wouldn't miss anything. No stone or crevice went unturned for me, and I still have a ton of ground to cover. Not to mention, every NPC you meet is super interesting and have their own super interesting side quests that feel like they have a direct impact on the lands between. You can easily miss most of what is in this world, and that is a thing of beauty to me. It is without a doubt the most packed and rich open world I have ever played in terms of exploration and constantly seeing new things that both intrigue and terrify. I love that there are no map markers. I played 2 other huge open world games this month, and while I think these 2 games are fantastic, they never incentivized exploration in the way Elden Ring does, because they essentially already tell you what the worlds have to offer when you open the map. Both the map and the screen in general is littered with objectives and icons and text that can serve as nice reminders of what you're supposed to be doing and what you're getting, but it can reach points of sensory overload to where my brain becomes overwhelmed with the amount of information I am seeing at one time. While I may have a lot of fun playing the game and, looking at it, sometimes I have to pause it and just take a break. Elden Ring takes a very simple approach to that formula and says, fuck all that, do it yourself. I can't express to you how great of a feeling it was just going around and finding stuff at my own pace without the game constantly nudging me to see something that it wants me to see, and not seeing my map and screen being automatically littered with shit everywhere was refreshing. These simple omissions of apparent and immediate information does so much for enhancing the joys and horrors of exploring without ever feeling tiring. I wanted to keep looking around regardless of how much I was getting my ass whooped or how intimidating a certain enemy slumbering in the distance was. I heard a lot of people say that this approach was revolutionary for open world games, but I don't think that it is. It's just that so few games try this approach that when it is implemented, it is seen as revolutionary when in reality, it should just be the norm. Maybe with Elden Ring being such a gaming phenomenon and the video game industry being so contemporary in its nature, we'll see more games adopt this approach. I don't think it will be likely, but it's definitely worth keeping an eye on. I love the art direction. This is easily FromSoft's most colorful and vibrant looking game in their catalog. The Souls games always had a grim color palette to them, which fits the dark medieval fantasy setting of those games, but it never appealed to me much. I found Bloodborne and Sekiro to have way more interesting artistic visions and aesthetics, to where both of those games will always stand out to me when I look back at them, as opposed to the original Souls trilogy just being amorphously gray and brown whenever I think about them. Elden Ring is so unapologetic with how coruscating it is. It has so many areas that exude personality with every fiber of their color usage. It's crazy to think that they all exist in one game. I'll never forget when I first wandered into Caelid accidentally and the sky turned blood red, fitted with disgusting looking spores, corpses, mutated monsters, and blood gulches. Or when I took what seemed to be a short elevator ride that just kept going down and down and down until I got to the underground, which was its own cosmic tomb with its own star system. Or when I got to Hogwarts with these Burger King looking ass wizards. Everywhere I went, there was always a beauty to behold. It never got old getting out of a dungeon or a castle and seeing the giant golden tree gracing the lands with its luminescence. And while I'm on the subject, I need to know what they're feeding their art team at FromSoft, because the sheer volume of unique and disgustingly sick enemy designs is off the charts. There has to be at least over 100 different types of enemies in this game that all animate and attack differently from one another. Each one is endemic to their own locale, so the world being as huge as it is means something or someone will always surprise you. Some of these designs are straight up mind-boggling, like how high did you have to be to come up with the idea of hand spiders? The main bosses especially look fucking sick as hell, and again, it's ridiculous to think that this is all in one game. And finally, I love the gameplay. I'm going to say something that may come off as blasphemous if you're a Souls purist, although I did allude to it earlier, so here goes. I don't like Dark Souls, but I love Bloodborne and Sekiro. These two games were not only way more visually appealing, but their gameplay I felt was more exciting and dynamic than the Souls games. I still revere Sekiro as being the game that ruined most games' combat systems for me because of how viscerally intimate it was, and it was my favorite game from FromSoft until Elden Ring came out. Elden Ring takes a lot of combat cues and workings from the Souls games, but it adds various elements from both Bloodborne and Sekiro to where it feels like a cumulative combat system with so much baked into it. There has never been this many options in a FromSoft game before. There are a lot of ways to play Elden Ring that rewards unique playstyles, granted you upgrade the right stats and find the necessary items. The amount of options presented in customizing your build and weapons feels near limitless. Also, whoever suggested to the animation team that enemies should now monumentally delay their attacks to mess with your flow and rhythm deserves a raise. When it comes to the gameplay, I think it's FromSoft's best work overall because though it is immensely challenging, it's extremely accessible. Although I still prefer Sekiro's combat, there's nothing topping that visceral intimacy. In short, I love Elden Ring. I only have 50 hours in it so far, and I feel like I have another 100 or so before I actually beat it. I still haven't fought Millennia or Radin yet. I plan on playing more of it when I have time later this summer, but those 50 hours were incredible. Elden Ring is everything that I wanted Skyrim to be, and that just leaves me with a couple of questions for FromSoft. How do you top Elden Ring? Where the hell do you as a studio creatively go from here? What more could you possibly achieve after creating such a phenomenal and one-of-a-kind experience that everyone else in the industry will no doubt try to copy? Those questions will eventually be answered a few years down the line, but for now, I'm just going to enjoy it the most I can, praise it the most I can, and hopefully avoid the never-ending discussion of video game difficulty. Elden Ring is godly. This month is going down as the best month in video game history. You got two great sequels with Dying Light 2 and Forbidden West, one of the most fun fighting games in recent memory, one of the coolest and sickest looking beat 'em ups ever made, an absolute skateboarding platforming gem, and an all-time gaming phenomenon that will be talked about for years to come. And even though I wasn't all that into Kingdom of the Dead and Martha is Dead, these two games got some great reception and definitely will appeal more to others than they did to me. I didn't even get the chance to play Total Warhammer 3 yet, which I will eventually get to and talk about in a future video. But yeah, that's enough of me for now. I would love to hear what you guys are thinking in the comments below. Please like the video, subscribe if you haven't, and thank you so much for watching. I will see you guys next time. And my game of the month, you already know what it goes to. Roll the clip.